Yesterday, I posted a critique of this tweet from Kim Yong Hun, who identifies himself as the world's highest IQ record holder. And I noted several concerns with what he says here. Let me just briefly synopsize them here now. First thing is he appeals to his authority as having the world's highest IQ to suggest that that therefore equips him to have the best and most informed opinion on how to think about the Bible. And of course, that does not follow. So just to give you a couple examples, I gave yesterday in my video. Um, if you need the forecast for tomorrow, you go to the meteorologist. And if the meteorologist says it's going to rain, and then Kim Yong Hun comes along and says, "Well, I say it's going to be sunny, and I have the world's highest IQ," you're going to be like, "Yeah, buddy, I'm going to go with the meteorologist's forecast. Thanks a lot." And if you have cancer and your oncologist says you need to do this particular treatment for your cancer, let's say radiation therapy, and then Kim Yong-hun comes along and says, "Yeah, you don't need to do that. You can just have goji berry juice, and I have the world's highest IQ." Again, you're going to say, "Yeah, no thanks, buddy. I'm going to go with the oncologist." Because you defer to the fields of expertise in every different area subject matter, and just because you have an IQ doesn't automatically, a high IQ doesn't automatically equip you to have the subject matter expertise in every possible relevant field. And that certainly pertains to the Bible as well. So that was a big problem here. Another problem was the condescending presentation of the tweet. So Kim Yong Hun says the world needs to catch up to me because I have the world's highest IQ, which, as I noted, is just going to ironically repel the very people you ostensibly want to attract with your tweet. And then a third thing that is important to highlight is that insofar as Kim Yong Hun is claiming to be Christian here, and judging by the way that Christians respond to this tweet on social media, it seems like everybody is interpreting him as endorsing the truth of Christianity. Well, the irony here is that his wording is not Orthodox Christianity. He describes the Bible as the perfect, eternal, and final word of God, when in fact, in Christian theology, it is Jesus who is the eternal word of God, the Logos, as we read in John chapter 1. So he is conflating Jesus and the Bible in his language and descriptions, which really borders on a clumsy bibliolatry. And if you believe you are the one person we should all listen to when it comes to the status and authority of the Bible, presumably you would not stumble into a clumsy bibliolatry. So that is an indictment as well of that tweet. So I'm not a big fan at all of Kim Yong Hun's tweet. Now, this brings me to Dan McClellan, who posted his own tweet in response to Kim Yong Hun's tweet. And Dan McClellan says, as someone who knows significantly more about the Bible and knows the Bible significantly better than this individual, these beliefs are just dogmas that are not supported by any data whatsoever. Appealing to IQ to validate these dogmas is a laughable appeal to authority. Okay, so let me say first of all what I agree with in terms of what McClellan is saying. He's critiquing Kim Jong Un the same way I am. Is that to point out that I have a high IQ doesn't mean that you are therefore the person I should listen to when I want a weather forecast or want cancer treatment or want to understand theologically how to view the Bible. Having a high IQ doesn't necessarily equip you in that. Now, the other thing that I said in my video yesterday, which I maybe want to make more explicit now, is that I'm not a big fan generally of celebrity conversions. Now, as a growing up in the evangelical Christian church, we loved celebrity conversions. I remember in the early 1980s, late 70s, early 80s, when Bob Dylan came out as an evangelical Christian and he released a couple middling albums, Slow Train Coming and Saved, which were his Christian albums. And the evangelicals were all really excited about that. And then in the later 80s, they were excited about U2. And you're always looking for celebrities, whether it's musical artists or actors or any other well-known famous person who would be a Christian. And one of the problems with that is when you elevate celebrity conversions in a way that suggests somehow the credibility of Christianity increases when it is endorsed by a celebrity, then you could say he who lives or she who lives by the celebrity conversion also dies by the celebrity conversion. So if another person or that same person later deconverts, then does that commensurately decrease the credibility of Christianity because that person no longer, or this other person no longer endorses Christianity? And so when you put all this emphasis upon Kim Yong Hun as endorsing Christianity because he has the world's highest IQ, ooh, somehow this means Christianity is now more credible. Well, then what happens when a person with maybe a higher IQ later on says, I reject Christianity? Or what happens when Kim Jong Un himself later potentially rejects Christianity? Does now the credibility of Christianity decrease? So it's just an overall unwise approach to tie the credibility of Christianity to some celebrity conversion. Not only does being a celebrity or having a high IQ not equip you to be the final authority or arbiter on these questions, but then it ties the credibility of Christianity to the whims and whimsies of celebrities, which is just unwise. So I agree with Dan McClellan on that. Now, Dan McClellan, so I looked it up, and apparently his subject matter expertise as a biblical scholar is Second Temple Judaism, early Israelite religion, textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, cognitive science of religion, and conceptualizations of deity and divine agency in the Hebrew Bible. So, if we want to follow what I think is Dan McClellan's advice, is that you defer to subject matter experts to render opinions about various matters. Then, when it comes to issues like Second Temple Judaism or the conceptualization of deity in biblical Hebrew thought, you should defer to Dan McClellan. Here's, however, my one of two big points of disagreement with Dan McClellan's tweet is that his tweet is not simply talking about deferring to his opinion as a subject matter expertise when it comes to understanding some particular feature of biblical criticism or the conceptualization of deity in Hebrew thought. He's talking here, I guess, I mean, about Christian dogmas, systematic theological dogmas. And systematic Christian theological dogmas are not simply deductions, abductions, or inductions from biblical material. The relationship between the Bible and Christian systematic theology is much more complicated than that. Uh, Stan Grins, uh, uh, I studied under Stan Grins in the 1990s. He was a well-known Baptist theologian. He talked about the Bible as the norming norm of theological reflection in the Christian tradition. And I think that's a helpful descriptor. So the way that you do systematic theology in the Christian tradition is it is essentially informed by the Bible. And if you affirm sola scriptura as a Protestant would, then it really does become the norming norm of Christian systematic theological reflection. But it's not the only input, and it's not the only um, data that one would appeal to. The data that one would appeal to in terms of Christian doctrine is not only things of which Dan McClellan is a subject matter expert, but also other areas like philosophy and philosophical arguments and historical arguments and appeals to experience and um, a broader sense of reflective equilibrium as one is bringing one's Christian tradition, one's um, historic creeds that one is using as sort of a prism or a framework for interpreting the Bible and doing theology, as one brings all of that into critical reflection with contemporary Wissenschaft. So, for example, any Christian theologian who's trying to do their work in the big picture sense has to engage with natural science, for example, and understand how do we understand doctrines of creation in light of contemporary understandings of cosmology and of biology. And all of this feeds into a comprehensive process of reflective equilibrium, which I think helpfully, but not comprehensively, can be understood in terms of the Wesleyan quadrilateral, so that there are multiple sources that one appeals to with the Bible as the norming norm in doing their systematic theological reflection. And this means that the subject matter expertise that one would appeal to when one ultimately wants to make doctrinal claims about the Bible is involves expertise that is far beyond Dan McClellan's expertise. So he's not himself the individual gatekeeper for making the kinds of claims that Kim Yong Hun wants to make. He's only one of a multiple catalog of experts. He is an expert, but of his domain and not of all these other domains. And that's lacking because the way that this is written here, it's like, you have to appeal to Dan McClellan in order to be justified in making any kinds of claims like Kim Yong Hun makes, which is just an overstatement of his subject matter expertise and or a misunderstanding of what Christian systematic theology is and how it is done. Also, and this has just come to my second point of critique of Dan McClellan. It's a lesser point, but it's nonetheless worth noting. He says appealing to IQ to validate these dogmas is a laughable appeal to authority. On the one hand, I'll say, I mean, I agree that appealing to IQ is indefensible, but I will say this. One of my critiques of Kim Yong Hun's tweet was the condescending nature of it, and to describe him in turn as a laughable appeal to authority rather than, for example, an indefensible appeal to authority is unnecessarily alienating and condescending on Dan McClellan's part. So he could have made his point much more effectively by saying it's indefensible as an appeal to authority rather than laughable. Having said that, let me admit, I mean, I myself, and I think probably most of us are at one or another point apt to use that same sort of alienating rhetoric when talking about others. So I'm certainly not saying I'm blameless in that regard. Anyway, to conclude, those are my thoughts on Dan McClellan. So I was sympathetic with his general critique of Kim Yong Hun as overstating his own subject matter expertise simply because he has a high IQ. But I also don't think that Dan McClellan is the gatekeeper on these very topics because he has expertise in some aspects of the Hebrew Bible. That doesn't give him expertise in all the disciplines that one would appeal to in making Christian systematic theological claims.